and Nomi. And then we've a special guest with us for this panel, David Reddle. So David Reddle is a former Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Information and Communications and former NTIA Administrator. Again, you can find a full bio of David on the conference webpage. So welcome to all the panelists, and thank you very much for participating in our conference. So I've got a set of questions that kind of hopefully we can tie all these things together. So I'll lob the first question out to Scott, and then let every one of the other panelists weigh in on it. So pretty easy to start off with. So Scott, well, maybe not. Scott, what would you consider the key takeaways from your panel? What should we walk away remembering from this?
So I have a quote from Peter that is, "Spectrum is not rocket science." So I guess that would be my first takeaway. But to follow up from that, we had a lot of discussion about sharing in terms of trust, coordination, and collaboration are critical to achieve the end goals. And I think David also pointed out an interesting thread that space service bands are already inherently shared with other services, and then even within the bands, within the space services across a range of operators who do their own self-coordination, so that some of those elements that are maybe less typical in the terrestrial environment have been part of the heritage of the space services.
Okay, thank you. Nomi, how about from your panel? You're on mute.
I think first we talked about what is spectrum sharing, and I think there was general consensus that it's an operation of independent systems that's close enough together that dynamic mechanisms would be required for harmful interference. We then next talked a little bit about how real is scarcity, and I guess I heard from our panelists that maybe there isn't such real scarcity, but yet the high value placed on spectrum, and that often operators sometimes ask for spectrum, not just because they need it, but they also, they want to be careful that they still have it. So anyhow, but there was great optimism for spectrum sharing. We went through some of the historic efforts. Everybody thought that we're learning a lot from CBRS, although it has been very complex. And I think that there was a lot of caution on our panel about while we should definitely be looking at all kinds of technologies to embrace sharing, that let's try not to make it too complicated. There was also a lot of interest in some of the technologies to support spectrum sharing, such as having better identifiers so that there could be better enforcement, things like that. And good discussions about trust, which I kept thinking about overnight as well. So anyhow, that's much more of it. Those are a few headlines. Yeah.
Thank you. Ari, next.
Yeah, there was a little bit of overlap between my panel and Nomi's panel. The overlap between all of the panels. I mean, my key takeaways were the gold standard still seems to be exclusive use spectrum where possible, but there was a realization by the panelists on my panel that there's not a whole lot of spectrum left that can be allocated in that way. And so sharing is going to happen. It's a reality. There was a lot of discussion about making sure that the rules are set as clearly as possible. Ex post enforcement when the rules are violated was viewed as very, very important. The trust point that Nomi mentioned was also stressed a lot. So on my panel, it was important for all stakeholders to trust each other and to understand each other's motivations, including the motivations of federal government users that are focused on mission and may not be able to sort of quantify the benefits of their use of the spectrum in the same way that the commercial providers can.
All right, thank you. And so David, since you weren't a moderator of a panel, can you take a step back and give us the high-level view of this?
Sure. So I looking at the themes across all of these panels, I think there's three things that struck me as I looked at them. One was, and this happens seemingly with every new issue in tech and telecom. We're talking about spectrum sharing, and I think if you asked every one of the moderators to define spectrum sharing, you'd probably get a different definition. I think when we had a look at these panels, the panelists were all working for different operating definitions. And that is a function of you are where you sit, right? And that struck me as part of this, that we don't have a common vocabulary for what we mean when we talk about this. I mean, to take the most striking example, the commercial sector, commercial wireless looks at sharing. It says sharing means DoD, shrink your footprint as small as you can and we'll get everything else. And you ask DoD, and DoD sharing means we change absolutely nothing and you just find a way to work around everything we're already doing. And neither of those are what is an optimal outcome. And I think that leads to the second point that all of the moderators have brought up so far, and that's trust. And I think what you can see here, and maybe what we danced around a little bit, but I think we got to, is the trust deficit in these conversations. There is a trust deficit between the FCC and the NTIA at the moment. So you've got two spectrum regulators that can't trust each other for the time being. There is a trust deficit between government users who constantly hide behind the fact that they have national security as an excuse, whether it's true or not, and the wireless industry who constantly hides behind we pay for spectrum as the reason why they should have it. Neither are good answers unless you can justify why you need to be in that position. And I think until we get past that trust deficit, you're not going to be able to solve this spectrum sharing problem that we see. And it's a problem because there's real opportunities that I think are being held back. And we heard a little bit of that throughout the different panels. The last thing I'd put out there is, and this is one that I know Silicon Flatirons has done a lot of work on, I've talked about before at Silicon Flatirons, is if we're going to look at spectrum sharing, we have to address the disparate economic interests when it comes to spectrum sharing. As the very end of the last panel, Len Callie brought up, the economics of a commercial wireless system. You get to free ride on their investment. You get the scale benefits of being part of a handset economy that's a commercial off-the-shelf handset economy. And that's great, but that economic value is of limited utility to some government users. And frankly, what they're trying to do may not be explainable in what we ordinarily think of as sort of Wall Street economic terms. And I think sort of a 30,000-foot overview, that's really the things I saw. Common definitions need to be addressed, trust deficit needs to be addressed, and the economic incentives of each of the parties need to be addressed.
Oh, great, thank you. So Nomi, I'll toss the next one out to you, which is, you were the lead of the technology panel. So are there areas of do you leave this with hope or concern? Are you an optimist or a pessimist? Where?
I definitely am an optimist. And I think, I go back to, and then I want to come back to the trust point though, but I go back to Marty Cooper's comments that that always our technology, emerging new technologies have more than kept up with our needs, and we heard so many of them, throughout our panel. So I'm definitely an optimist. And just tying that into the points we've just heard from my fellow panelists here, that I do think that the technology investments that we can make to increase trust at this stage, they may be more important than the technologies to increase efficiency. Which I think in the past I might not have said, but I think it's becoming that important, because I think if we can make progress in the technologies that increase trust, I think then we'll have more runway to develop better technologies to increase efficiency. So that would include things like technologies to improve identification, enforcement, and probably alongside some of the privacy and security. So I think those are. If I were to give advice, coming out of our panel, I think that's going to be really important.
Great, thank you. Any of the other panelists want to add on that?
I agree. I'm optimistic as well, because I do think the technology is improving. And I do agree with Nomi that focusing a little bit more on technology that actually helps build trust among stakeholders as opposed, I mean, both are important. Increasing efficiency is very important as well, but the trust is really important. And I think something that came up on my panel was a lot of discussion even today. I don't know how long it's been since the 5 gigahertz DFS issue surfaced, but people are still talking about it because, it took a long time to resolve the issue when people were essentially, disenabling the DFS functions or capabilities on devices that were supposed to have those capabilities. When they did that, interference was caused. The victims were very concerned about it. It took a long time for them to resolve that interference issue. We got to figure out a way to address enforcement. We got to be able to, as Lynn, I think, mentioned on my panel, we got to figure out a better way to remediate these issues. And if we are able to do that, remediate more quickly, that will go a long way to building the trust that we all know that we need to have if spectrum sharing is going to become more extensive.
Just, I'll make a general comment. We can choose to be optimist or we can choose to be pessimist. I mean, that's an active choice. And, choosing optimism leans into building trust, right? Choosing optimism leans into trying to find partners and trying to, work through the problems. When we lean towards pessimism, we become insular, right? We kind of build those walls. And so I think if we're going to make progress in the area that, it came across on all the panels as being trust and collaboration, I think we have to decide to be optimistic. And that will, move us in those directions. Now, sure, he has battle scars, and I think you gotta figure out how to put some of those aside. Those that have been around longer have more, right? Those are the students here who are just getting into Spectrum. They don't carry that baggage, right? They tend to be inherently optimistic, and I think that's important.
Thank you. David, you looked like you're getting ready to say something there. Did you want to add to that?
No, I chuckle as the clearly the New York cynic on the group. That choosing to be optimistic is its choice, and I agree with Scott. It is. I think there is a bit of a first mover disadvantage that has played out time and again for being optimistic, and so it's a two-way street. Both sides of these transactions, or all the sides, when it comes to real, true dynamic sharing, are going to have to go in with a rosy outlook and fresh expectations. The expectation of I just get to do what I want and nothing gets impacted, which seems to be where everybody starts in these conversations, is going to have to get set aside. That playbook, unfortunately, has been run to exhaustion. And if we stick to that, as Scott points out, if we don't choose to go down a different path, we're gonna run up against that brick wall over and over again. And I'm hopeful that people go that direction.
Yeah, I mean, David makes a really good point. I mean, basically, we should be optimistic, but we also should not be under any illusions that we're going to get everything that we want. Based on everybody has scars here. Everyone has the scars to prove it, especially David. It's good to be optimistic, but we can't go in with rose-colored glasses. We really have to know what we're getting into and recognize that these issues are very, very difficult. A lot of strong feeling on all sides, and
No, Ari, you're absolutely right. I mean, look, I worked for industry, I worked for Congress, I worked for the administration in my career. And so I've sort of, at this point, I think everyone in spectrum policy has something they hate me for along the way, which is a unique to be in any rate. But yeah, I think part of the challenge to this, and I think these kinds of conversations help, is that everybody has to drop the pretense and have a real conversation about what is in the art of the doable, both technologically and economically. You can't expect the wireless industry to show up with billions and billions and billions of dollars to pay for spectrum that's unusable for them. And you can't expect the US government to make things that are physically impossible possible because we want to raise money by auctioning off spectrum. And I think the sooner we recognize that each side has a legitimate starting point from which we can all work, the better off we'll be. That's not where we are right now on spectrum policy. And frankly, the way things are going with everybody being locked down during a pandemic and not able to have face-to-face conversations, I think that's affirmatively harming us. It's not that I don't love doing these Zooms. I think we've all learned to embrace Zoom culture, but I've sat across from many of you at a negotiating table before or across a conference room table, and it is different. It's affirmatively different to sit across from someone and have a real, honest person-to-person conversation than doing it sitting at your desk, with 1,000 distractions around you. And I think, as crazy as that sounds, I don't know that we'll be able to have those frank conversations until people are sure they're not sitting there watching the recording light blink on Zoom while they're talking to somebody else.
Great comments. If I could just also add, I really like what each of my fellow panelists are saying. I just want to go back to Scott's point. I thought you said that really beautifully, Scott. And I wanted to tie in. There was a comment in the Q&A during my panel where John Chapin drew an analogy to what's being done today with roaming between mobile network operators. That one could say that is an existing example of sharing of local resources, and certainly you can see that in roaming. Trust is inherently there because there's a trusted commercial agreement and trusted usage of and trusted implementation of the agreement. And so I just think it's really nice proof that that sharing can work well when there's trust in quite innovative ways.
So let me kind of build on that, and you mentioned technology that could help us build trust, and then I want to go back to one of the comments that Andy Clegg made in Ari's panel about the I'll call it interference limits that came up from the time of Marconi, I think he said. Okay, and I've got some experience with that where an entity will claim interference limits that just, whoa, that there's, what's the justification for that? And that would seem to me to be one of the areas where we need to build trust, that we want to be able to know that the other party is speaking fairly and are dealing with the right kind of numbers. How do we establish an environment? Are there technological tools we should be developing? How do we establish this environment to ensure that we're not just arguing numbers with whoever yells the loudest?
I'll take a crack, but I'm not an engineer, but I will tell you that it was very interesting what Andy said. He was basically complaining that a lot of times the protection criteria that's developed that the incumbent systems always cite when they oppose or express concern about a new entrant coming in is always, was based on worst case analysis, right? And he was suggesting that that regulators move to a probabilistic analysis, a more, taking into consideration more what is likely to happen. I am a little, maybe I'm an incrementalist. I've seen the FCC try to do that in various proceedings, but I am also a little skeptical that the regulators are never going to go where Andy wants them to go there, because often in these FCC proceedings last a long time, the incumbents, they're formidable. They become very political, and they are stakeholders, often with significant political power. And the FCC, I think, just instinctively doesn't want to do anything that increases the potential for interference to any incumbent service. That said, the FCC has in recent years focused more on the probabilistic analysis, and they've sort of distinguished, they pushed away some of those old ITU recommended protection criteria. They've sort of distinguished them. I think that whatever happens is going to be incremental. Whatever progress is made to get the regulators to sort of focus more on likely case as opposed to worst case in their in setting these protection criteria is to be incremental. We're not, there's not going to be a significant change over a short period of time. But again, that's the lawyer's perspective.
I'll jump in. There's a question in the Q&A also that Pierre put in for us that points out that there was a comment about receiver standards as a bit of a thread throughout the comments, and I think I can tie that into what Ari was saying, which is politically, and it occurs both on Capitol Hill and at the agencies. It does seem like sometimes there is a tendency to believe that some services have an absolute right to exist without changing. And that can't be the case. We can't allow any service to just go out there and assume that the RF environment around them will never change and that they have an absolute right to exist. Receiver standards is a bit of a bit of a third rail for a lot of people who talk about this. And I'm not the first one to bring this up, but I feel like this is a good point to pivot to and say, but that doesn't mean you don't set ideas about receiver performance as part of the conversation. And you set expectations. And by the way, this goes towards our trust deficit point, which is that you need to set expectations that this is what the RF environment will look like. You need to build your device to assume you will be receiving this level of emissions from out of band. If you choose not to, we're not going to force you to build your receivers the way you want, but buyer beware, caveat emptor. If you build a cheap device and you get interference, it's a whole big mess and not the FCC's problem. They're going to tell you to go fix it yourself. And I think that's the issue we have to get to, is that right now it's a first in time, first in right situation. Once you put yourself out in the band, you've occupied that band, and God forbid there are any emissions in, whether they're your fault or not, you feel like you're owed a remedy. I think we have to set some kind of expectations. And once we set those expectations and both sides understand what they're getting into, you can establish that level of trust. I trust you will build a device that isn't so cheap that me operating within my parameters in my adjacent band is going to interfere with you and cause me to go to the FCC and answer questions. I think that would go a long way towards both what Ari is talking about and towards the trust deficit that we've all been talking about.
So I wanted to follow up on what David was saying, and maybe this also connects back to sort of some of the, the economics as well. And I think, when we think about Spectrum and some of these use cases, the scientific use case is an interesting and, from my perspective, somewhat different beast, right? Trying to operate significantly below the noise floor, or operating, investments in very expensive equipment, that are trying to push the state of the art. And it's hard to articulate a economic case, a lot of times with the scientific use case. And so I guess I'm posing a question to the panel with regards to sharing. We talk a lot about the federal users and the commercial users, but in some sense, scientific users are also the federal users. What's the thoughts there with regards to sharing and standards and managing systems that are operating near the thermal limit?
Interesting. Keith, I'll jump in. I think I'll just jump in, just share some technologies that I think are going to be important to cultivating this trust. And actually, I learned a lot of some of this maybe I had learned before, but some of this I more acutely learned in preparation for the panel. I learned about work that NTIA had asked SISMIC to do to see if they could use NTIA's and the FCC's equipment authorization rules, if they could be modified to require that all transmitters use unique identifiers. And I think that identifier is going to be, and I know I just mentioned it a little bit earlier, but just to say a little bit more about it, I think it's going to be really important because there's sort of an assumption out there that everybody will play nice with with usage of Spectrum, but people and companies cheat, and this, requires enforcement and requires incentives, and so that so we have a way to prosecute bad actors. And I think these identifiers are going to be important, and we have a history of doing this on radio, I guess you have ham radio also, where there's unique identifiers, you use small amounts of bandwidth. And I think that this concept, Dale was telling us a little bit about some work he's written on RF fingerprinting. I think it's going to be really important as an important way to create trust. And another thing I learned in preparing for the panel was I want to give credit to John Chapin for work he's doing I don't want to steal his thunder, but a concept he's putting together called Spectrum Science, which involves everything from the monitoring techniques, again, where you would need the identification, to management techniques, ways that you could perhaps dynamically control interference behavior, and then ways that you could also enable information sharing as well. So I do think all of this is going to be very important to finding new ways new ways to share, hopefully in a more complex, dynamic way than the more static methods of sharing that we have today.
So if I can chime in on that, Nomi, I don't disagree with you in terms of sort of fixed transmitters. I think, and somewhere Amy Stepanovich is smiling that I'm bringing this up. I think with respect to individual commercial mobile transmitters, I think you'd have a serious privacy concern with individual IDs. I mean, as it is, IMSI skimmers are enough of a privacy nightmare, and those are heavily controlled and regulated. So I don't disagree with you. I just throw that out as a cautionary tale.
You're so right. You're so right. Thank you, David. I did neglect to say that. And please go on. Yeah.
But to Scott's point, I hear you. And I think if we're going to be looking at how to ensure any of these uses for which you have as I said earlier, a non-Wall Street typical economic case, certainly scientific research falls into the bucket of non-Wall Street typical when we're looking at spectrum use. I think the leadership of how we're going to look at that is going to have to come from government. Whether it's the executive branch or the legislative branch, there's going to have to be someone who affirmatively says it is more important to society that we do X with respect to this band and this scientific research in this location or these locations than it is to put more spectrum in the commercial marketplace. And I don't know what those would look like, where those options would be, but I think it's something that if we're going to do it, it's going to have to be led by the government. It's not something the market's going to work out on its own because it's not a typical economic use case. So I just throw out there that if it's going to happen, I feel like it's got to come out of the .gov set.
You're smiling at that. Any comments to follow that up?
I agree with what David said about passive services and the scientific community and their use of the radio spectrum. Certainly, policymakers have to decide what is a public good, what they deem to be socially valuable, regardless of what the economic value might be, or what the perceived economic value might be. But that's what policymakers do. That's why we pay them the big bucks, right?
Keith, were we making big bucks when we were together? I don't remember.
I was just thinking about that.
That was a joke.
Anybody else want to pick that up, or? So I'm taking notes as we've been talking, and we mentioned early on, Nomi mentioned technology for trust. And I can think a number of technologies that were kind of brought up over the course of the conversation. One was Andy Clegg advocating for better propagation models. Nomi brought up transmitter IDs. We could talk about automated enforcement mechanisms. So kind of what other technologies are needed, and if you were the investor or the government deciding where to invest the money to push spectrum sharing forward, How would you prioritize these? Where would we start? Is
not
propagation
sure it
models the
starts-
most important thing, or
I'm not sure it starts with the government. And I'm going to sound like I'm beating a dead horse here, but I'm going to come back to the trust question. I think it's got to start by some sort of consensus about a way to move forward that respects all the players in the game. And that can't be handed out from the United States government. It's going to have to be, you know, to use an overused term at this point, a public-private partnership. I mean, not in the traditional sense. It's going to have to be a meeting of the minds between commercial users, unlicensed users, government users, scientific passive service users. All of these people are going to have to agree, yes, this has promise for us and we're not being cut out. I think to date, that's part of the challenge that we've seen with all of the paths we've taken forward, is that somebody feels like they're in the short end of the stick and that they were told this is the solution and get on board. I just think until we have everybody at the table, and frankly, the closest we've come to having everybody at the table to play the game is when we had the PCAST during the Obama administration. I think that was the closest we came to having enough people at the table to have a general consensus on trying to drive some technology forward in spectrum sharing. Now, look, we could spend another complete hour arguing about the failings of the PCAST model. And I know Ari and I have spent several hours arguing the failings of the PCAST model in the past. I think that's the closest we've come. And it does show that you can get people at the table to make compromises. You need a bigger group than that, or at least a more representative group. But I think that's how you're going to have to do it going forward. So to the extent that the government has a role at all, I would say it's their convening authority. It's getting people at the table to have candid conversations.
okay. Ari, you've spent hours arguing with him. Do you want to argue now?
No, I agree with what Dave's saying. I mean, I'm trying to figure out a way to disagree, but I'm agreeing with everything he's saying. I will say that just, you know, the debate about what propagation model to use. I mean, I don't want to bore people. I've spent too much time at the FCC in these proceedings on both sides, sometimes representing potential new entrants, so, you know, sometimes representing incumbents, and, you know, getting everyone to agree on what the right propagation model should be will end up being very difficult. I'm almost sort of convinced to take the approach that Coleman was suggesting, which was to whatever, no matter how messy the process was or unfair the process was in setting whatever the protection criteria that, you know, the applicable protection criteria is, set that criteria and then have the parties be have the ability, give the parties the ability to contract around that criteria. It doesn't help often new entrants if the government, if the FCC sets the standards for protecting incumbents that are just too difficult. It's going to make it very difficult for new entrants to actually put together a viable business. I mean, and we've seen that a lot. We've seen how new entrants have spent years and years at the FCC to getting approval for some new service to be introduced into a frequency band, but only fail at the end of that process, failing from a business perspective because the rules were too stringent, viewed as too stringent. But you know, once there are rules, parties can contract around them, and we've seen that work too. That framework actually work as well. So you know, I just throw it out there. I guess I apologize for being an incrementalist here. I do think that we're never going to have agreement on what the right propagation model is, or what the correct, you know, whether the FCC should be focused on probabilistic analysis or worst case analysis and determining potential for interference. That's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very difficult to get everyone to agree on those types of concepts. But, you know, I think in some ways that it's more important to just sort of set the standard and then have the, parties have, give parties the ability to contract around them, whatever they are.
Nomi, Scott, any thoughts on
I think it was well said by Ari. No additional comments.
I agree as well. I do think that these efforts, and I like what David said too about probably the importance of public-private partnerships and also of engineering organizations and standards organizations in establishing the role of these new elements. I see in the questions we've gotten there was a comment from John Rowe about giving standard organizations a greater role. I think that's very interesting, and Patry is also asking about identifiers and fingerprinting, and I think his comment is I know he's asking a question about how to get this over regulatory boundaries internationally, but I do think that's all the more reason why this needs to be debated in engineering organizations to determine how we will have to do it internationally. I completely agree with the premise there. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, we've got about just under 10 minutes left. I guess I'd like to ask for closing thoughts on this. I mean, where do we go? And so start back at the beginning with Scott.
You know, I guess again I'll circle back to being an optimist, and I think it's continuing conversations such as these. Getting one of the comments we had discussed in our panel was a couple of things. I mean, one was we have to make Spectrum understandable to the non-expert to have broader engagement, and then we also have to. It's important to engage a multidisciplinary wide group of stakeholders to be looking at problems, to be bringing the perspectives that are unique for each one of the stakeholders to the issues. So I think it's hard work. It takes conversations and efforts to gather, discuss, collaborate, and events like this conference help to move that forward.
Thank you. Nomi?
I also agree with Scott. I remain an optimist. I think there are so many really exciting technologies that offer so much promise for inter-service sharing. And I think we need, I think we learned in our panels, and about the many wonderful historic efforts that are happening, such as Jonathan shared updates about the experiments the ITS experiments that they're running. I think the CBRS effort has given us an incredible opportunity to have a really large real world experiment in spectrum sharing, from which we're learning so much. So we can see this is worth it. And I think we just need to continue having these discussions I think this is very good and a great conference. Thank you for putting it together, Keith.
Thank you.
I agree, Keith. This has been a great conference. I've really learned a lot. One thing I'd like to see, and I think we probably will see something like this during the Biden administration, is kind of this exploration of sharing by design, or identification of a spectrum band where sharing is more viewed as being more feasible than other bands. Designation of a couple of bands for sharing, and I think it would be a great one of these sort of a great experiment, greenfield experiment, a place where there are incumbent operations, but where we think that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to try to reallocate the spectrum because of the incumbent uses and because of the difficulty of moving incumbents off that spectrum. I think if we can identify a couple of bands, and I know that people like John Leibowitz has already suggested a couple of bands, if we can identify spectrum bands like that, I think it would be well worth the effort to try to sort of, promote spectrum sharing in those bands. And I didn't get a chance to ask my panel the question that I wanted to ask them about that, but it's definitely something that I'd like to see.
Well, Ari, from your lips to the Energy and Commerce Committee's ears, because not 14 hours ago, they put out text that would make 3.1 to 3.45 available for
There you go.
opportunistic use until such time they decide to put licenses in there.
Well, that's great. And they did it because I was thinking about it, right, David?
It's the telepathy link you have with the staff. Yes, I'm sure.
Okay, David, I'm looking to you to back clean up here.
Yeah, no, I thank you, by the way, for having me on this panel. I realize I was not a moderator on any of the earlier panels. So in some ways I am, Waldorf and Statler from the Muppet Show, coming in from the balcony with snarky remarks. But I think this was a really good panel and a really good wrap up to what was a very productive Spectrum conference. Thanks, Silicon Flatirons, for that, as usual. I think we have a pretty decent consensus among the group that there is a path forward. It's just going to be real hard. And until we have, as Scott put it, a decision to be optimistic by all of the parties that would be involved, we're a little bit at a standstill. And once we get there, I think we've got the technology. And if we get people to have the drive to do it, we really could move forward, at least along the lines Ari is talking about, with finding some bands to try this out and see if it's worth doing on a larger scale, or if it's a spot market kind of thing where we can't find a broad set of spectrum bands or spectrum opportunities where this makes sense. But we'll never know unless people take Scott's approach and say, okay, I'm willing to set aside my pessimism and my preconceived notions of what I'm going to get out of this band, and I'm going to go forward and say, how can we move to the future on this one?
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. I think we've got to wrap it up and move to the questions now. Again, citing the Phil Weiser rule, we've actually got 2 students lined up this time with questions. So I guess you've generated a lot of interesting thoughts here. First student is Caden Daly.
So thank you everybody for all the information. This has been really interesting. I don't have much of a tech background, but I want to definitely get involved. Got a little bit of an economics background, so hopefully that can be a little bit useful. But my question is kind of centered around what the role of like transactional law and contracts would play in spectrum sharing. So I guess, is there a significant role for it? Let's see, I've got it right here. Or are like the constraints and limitations that have been placed on it, do they make the opportunity costs for getting actual transactional law involved too high, if that makes sense at all?
I think it's a great question, and I do think there's a role for contract law. Again, this happens all the time within the communications industry. The standards get set by the government, but that doesn't mean that private parties can't themselves negotiate around the standards. And if everyone agrees, if the sort of the bilateral negotiation, in the example of spectrum sharing, if the party that has the spectrum agrees that it's okay for a party that wants to share the spectrum, it doesn't really matter what the rules are. I mean, they can work around the rules, but setting the rules it's very important to set the rules. Those are standards that the government sets. But if the parties agree that they can deviate from those standards without any one party raising any issues with the government, then they can do that. And situations, contract law is very important. Negotiating those contracts, those agreements those voluntary agreements becomes very important.
I think one thing you brought up that I think is worth noting is the one line you used in there was bilateral. I think this only makes sense when you're talking about a bilateral relationship. And if you want to see where this plays out, obviously if we're looking at a opportunistic environment, you can't know who the parties are, right? All the parties is anybody who has the right equipment and is willing to play by the rules. So there is no way to really negotiate a contractual change to that. But if you want to see how it plays out with fewer parties than that, look what's currently happening between the United States government, T-Mobile, and Dish with respect to shutting off their CDMA network. I mean, at bottom, that is a question of contract and antitrust law, and it's playing out very publicly in a way that is making it difficult to move the ball forward if you're T-Mobile, because they want to shut down an older technology and they're having a challenge doing so because of existing contractual arrangements. So I would say, I would urge some caution. I'm not sure it's the magic bullet we would all like it to be when it comes to trying to find ways to make spectrum sharing easier. But are absolutely right. Obviously, in the CMRS world where you have all these bilateral relationships, it makes great sense.
I love the question, and I love that my fellow panelist, who's an attorney, answered it first, since it's a contract law. I love that. I guess I would just also point back to, I know I commented earlier about roaming as an example of where there is existing proof for sharing local system resources, and that certainly fits right into Ari's answer, where two or more commercial operators found a way through their own agreement and through contractual agreement to find a way to share spectrum. And then certainly the FirstNet AT&T example is another example of the same thing. So I think we have really nice precedent for hopefully continuing to do just what you're suggesting with your good question.
Great, thank you very much.
And our next student question is from Taylor Hartley. Taylor, if you'd come up here.
All right. Hello again. Taylor Hartley. I'm a master business student, graduate in May. So this has been a really fun 2 days. I learned a lot. I think my biggest takeaway was just how important it is to use the spectrum efficiently. And while I thought DSS or dynamic spectrum sharing, I think that's super cool. And I know this has been mostly conversations between science and policy, and I know that things like government incentives and policy is really going to help drive, using the spectrum efficiently. So where do I come into play? As a young businesswoman who's interested in this space, who's passionate about it, what can I do to promote, internally within businesses to promote this, to use it efficiently? And how do I help everyone build trust within this area? What can I do?
I think a lot of the trust is built on personal relationships and networks. So, what you can do as you understand your organization's goals is understand how they interact with other organizations, or how do they cross, where are the conflicts, and how can you have really frank and open conversations to the extent you can share information. And build relationships, and your colleagues, you will move through different organizations, right? As David pointed out, he's sat on opposite sides of a three-sided table there. So I think that as you go through your career, it's that network and those relationships that will enable you to be effective going forward.
Yeah, I can't improve on what Scott said. It is very much an interpersonal game. The spectrum world, while it may be growing as more and more people get interested in it, it's a fairly small community as technological community go. And I think absolutely when it comes to what you can do to help, it's It's show up with an open mind, right? Based on what we were talking about before, and build relationships with the right incentives in mind.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a couple of questions online. We've got some themes here that have gone across the panels. So I'll read one from Peter Burrell. When it comes to not policing transmitter receiver quality, is there a carrot and stick approach the FCC implement? This could be along the lines of a threshold that they could have no guard band on the radio, but if it doesn't, they need to eat into their lease for a guard band. Anyone want to attack that?
So I'll jump in, right? There's no one size fits all approach. And I'll channel my inner Dale Hatfield for this one. You know, no one has worked harder on adjacent band interference and receivers than Dale Hatfield in his career. You know, the reality is there's going to be different approaches depending on who the two adjacencies are, right? Two adjacent CMRS providers, as already pointed out, have every incentive to strike a contractual agreement to make sure that they're in a good spot and that they're maximizing the use of the band. They paid a lot of money for it. On the other hand, putting a CMRS provider next to a scientific band produces the kind of situation where you'd have a very hard time coming up with a carrot and stick approach that could work similar to the CMRS model, right? You've got high power versus low power. You've got money generating versus non-money generating, ostensibly. And so I think if you're going to look at this from an FCC perspective, it's going to have to be, you have to take sort of each new allocation at face value and say, how are we going to do this? Because there is no such thing as a standard interface between two adjacent spectrum bands. So I agree, carrots and sticks are great and mixtures of the two, but it's going to be individual tackling of each new situation.
I think David said it well. I mean, I know of situations where the FCC has actually expressed the expectation that the incumbent was going to have to take certain steps to protect itself from emissions from a new entrant. Making its operations more robust with filtering, or taking other measures. And I think we will likely see more actions like that, from the FCC and other regulators as the demand for spectrum increases. But it really, the burdens that are imposed on the incumbent vary from band to band, David said, based on whatever the conditions that exist in that particular frequency band. And I don't see that changing much in the near future.
That being said, I like where your head is at. I think there are going to be times when you have to look to internalize guard bands. I think there are going to be times where you have to look to say, we're going to put some performance requirements out there for your receivers. I think there are times when you're going to have to be more granular with emissions limits. All of those are potential options. And frankly, when you're looking at auction spectrum, looking at whether or not you build that into the auction revenue base, that some areas will be standard Part 27 rules. For the non-FCC geeks, that's the standard power levels that we see for almost all of the frequencies that are used in your cell phones, or if there will be more of a variable to it based on a more dynamic spectrum environment than we have typically auctioned off. I think those are all viable options, but absent a unique use case to put them on, it's hard to know which one is the right answer.
Okay, anyone else want to weigh in? Or okay, we've got another question that, again, from an anonymous attendee, which is, Any thoughts on the need for precise positioning in the context of using detailed propagation models?
I know when to let engineers answer the question.
I was going to say, Keith, I was going to defer to you. You have more expertise than I do on propagation.
Now, my thoughts are that precise positioning is very important. Knowing your propagation model for very precise propagation is going to depend very much on your position. If you're in an urban setting and your position accuracy doesn't tell you whether you're behind a tree or behind a building versus in the middle of the street on a direct line with the transmitter, you're going to get a completely different set of answers. So the positioning is very important. And it will become more important as we get into higher frequencies, which have smaller propagation distances. And hence, you're going to have much more accurate positioning and propagation analysis. Anyone else want to jump in on that?
I certainly agree. And especially, I agree with your point, and especially as cell sizes become smaller and smaller and smaller. I don't know that I have that much else to answer on it, but I definitely certainly agree with that point.
I would add that while propagation models are great for a priori decision making, once you've got things in the field, and as we're seeing play out now, as the FCC looks at its most recent iteration of mapping, there is also a role for ignoring propagation models and doing real world testing and finding out what the ground truth is. So I think it's worth throwing that out there, that while we agonize a lot over ex ante propagation modeling, we should as concerned with ex post testing.
I couldn't agree more with you on that, David. Measurement campaigns are critical moving forward as well. Let's see, I think we've answered all the questions that we've got at this point. So thank you very much, everybody. This has been a great conference. Thank you to the moderators and David Reddle. Very interesting conversation. I enjoyed it. I even got to answer a few questions myself. So thank you. So with that, the formal part of our conference is over. I'd like to go into a few announcements before we close. So